Hello everyone, I hope you're having a wonderful day. Today we're diving into one of the most emotional and suspenseful chapters yet. After the gang from Tieu Lac's past finally finds them, fear takes over her heart. Terrified that her mother and little daughter will become the next targets, she begins to lose hope. But with no wealth, no bodyguards, and no powerful company behind him anymore, can the CEO truly protect the family he sacrificed everything for? As old enemies close in and danger surrounds their peaceful village, will love and courage be enough to keep Tieu Lac and their daughter safe? Stay with us until the very end to witness this gripping battle. And if you enjoy emotional family dramas filled with suspense, betrayal, and unforgettable twists, don't forget to subscribe so you never miss our next episode. The ride home from the village market was unusually quiet. Normally, Tieu Lac would tell stories about the customers they had met that day. Their little daughter would clap her tiny hands from the small seat attached to the bicycle cart. The CEO would laugh, teasing both of them until the road echoed with happiness. But today, no one spoke. Only the sound of the bicycle wheels rolling across the dusty village road broke the silence. The basket of strawberries that had been knocked onto the ground sat empty beside them. Neither of them cared about the lost fruit anymore. There was something far more frightening weighing on their minds. The scar-faced man had returned. Not only had he found Tieu Lac, he now knew exactly where she lived. The CEO glanced toward her several times. She kept her head lowered. Her hands tightly gripped the edge of the cart. Although she tried to remain calm, he noticed they were trembling. When they finally arrived home, Tieu Lac's mother stepped outside carrying their granddaughter. The little girl smiled brightly the moment she saw her parents. She stretched out both tiny hands. "Mama, Dada." The innocent laughter instantly softened the heavy atmosphere. The CEO forced himself to smile. He lifted his daughter into his arms and kissed her forehead. For just a moment, he wanted to believe nothing had happened. But Tieu Lac couldn't hide it. Her mother immediately noticed her pale face. "What happened?" she asked gently. Tieu Lac hesitated, then quietly replied, "We met someone from the past." Her mother's expression changed immediately, her eyes filled with fear. "Who?" Tieu Lac slowly whispered a single name. The older woman's body froze. She instinctively pulled her granddaughter closer. "No," she murmured, "how could they find us?" The CEO looked between the two women. Until this moment, he realized there were still parts of Tieu Lac's past she had never spoken about. That evening, after putting their daughter to sleep, the three adults sat together beneath the dim light of a single lamp. Outside, the countryside remained peaceful. Inside, the air felt painfully heavy. Tieu Lac finally broke the silence. "Before I met you," she said softly to the CEO, "I used to sell fruit near the bus station." He nodded quietly. He remembered the old photograph the scar-faced man had shown. "There was a group," she continued. "They collected protection money from every small vendor. If someone refused, they destroyed everything. They beat people. They threatened families." The CEO listened without interrupting. "My father tried to stop them once." Her voice began shaking. "A week later, our house was burned." Silence filled the room. The CEO slowly clenched his fists beneath the table. "My father was badly injured. After that, my mother and I had no choice but to leave." Tears quietly rolled down Tieu Lac's face. "I thought they had forgotten about us. But today, they found me again." Her mother wiped away her own tears. "I told you, we should have moved farther away." Tieu Lac lowered her head. "They'll come back. I'm not afraid for myself." She turned toward the bedroom where their daughter was sleeping peacefully. "I'm afraid for them." The CEO quietly stood up. He walked toward the small bedroom. Their daughter slept peacefully beside her grandmother's old handmade blanket, completely unaware that danger had already reached their doorstep. He gently touched her tiny hand, then made a silent promise. No matter what happened, no one would hurt this child, not while he was still breathing. The next morning, the CEO woke before sunrise. Instead of heading directly to the strawberry fields, he carefully walked around the house, examining every window, every fence, every entrance. The wooden gate barely closed properly. The backyard fence had several broken sections. Anyone could easily enter during the night. He quietly picked up several old tools: hammer, nails, wooden planks. Without saying a word, he began repairing everything himself. Tieu Lac walked outside carrying breakfast. She looked surprised. "What are you doing?" He smiled gently. "Making our home safer." She watched him reinforce the wooden gate, repair broken locks, strengthen the backyard fence. The work wasn't perfect. He had never built fences before. But every nail, every board, was placed with determination. Several neighboring villagers noticed. Without asking, two elderly farmers walked over carrying extra lumber. "We've got some leftover wood." One of them smiled. Another neighbor arrived with stronger rope. Someone else brought metal hinges. The CEO looked at everyone in surprise. "You don't have to help," the elderly farmer laughed. "In this village, we protect our own." Those simple words nearly brought tears to Tieu Lac's eyes. By late afternoon, the little house looked completely different. The gate was stronger, the fence stood taller. Even simple lights had been placed around the yard. It wasn't enough to stop determined criminals, but it gave the family something they hadn't felt since yesterday: a little hope. That evening, the CEO quietly spoke with several trusted villagers. "If you notice anyone suspicious, please tell me immediately." One middle-aged man nodded. "We've already seen 3 unfamiliar motorcycles near the old warehouse." The CEO's expression became serious. "So they really stayed?" The man continued, "They've been asking questions about your family, especially about Tieu Lac." The CEO thanked him, but inside, his concern only grew. Later that night, everyone had gone to bed. The village became silent. Only insects sang beneath the moonlight. The CEO remained awake, sitting quietly on the front porch, watching the empty road, listening, waiting. He no longer had bodyguards, no private security team, no powerful company protecting him, no influence, no wealth. All he had now were his own 2 hands and the determination to protect the people inside that small wooden house. Several kilometers away, inside the abandoned warehouse, the scar-faced man slammed a bottle onto the table. "So, the villagers are protecting them." One of his followers nodded. "They're becoming cautious." The scar-faced man slowly smiled. "Good. Fear grows faster when people believe they're finally safe." He unfolded another piece of paper. This time, it wasn't a photograph. It was a rough hand-drawn map of Tieu Lac's home. Every entrance, every window, every path leading into the village. Someone had been watching them far longer than they realized. The night grew quieter with every passing hour. Most of the village had already fallen asleep. Only a few porch lights remained glowing in the darkness. The CEO stayed seated outside the house. A simple wooden stick rested beside him. It wasn't much of a weapon, but it reminded him of something important. For the first time in his life, no one else was standing between danger and the people he loved. If anything happened tonight, he would be the one protecting them. Inside the house, Tieu Lac couldn't sleep either. She lay beside their daughter, gently stroking the little girl's hair. Every tiny movement outside made her heart race. The memories she had buried for years returned one after another. Broken fruit stalls, threats shouted in the middle of the market, her father lying injured after trying to resist, the flames that had swallowed their old house. She squeezed her eyes shut. She had promised herself she would never let her daughter experience that kind of fear. Never. Unable to stay in bed any longer, she quietly stepped outside. The CEO immediately looked back. "You should be resting." She shook her head. "I know you're pretending to be calm." He smiled faintly. "And you're pretending not to be afraid." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The cool wind carried the scent of rice fields across the yard. Tieu Lac slowly sat beside him. "I'm sorry." The CEO turned toward her. "What are you apologizing for?" "They came because of me. If I hadn't returned, if I hadn't met you, you wouldn't have lost everything." The CEO gently took her hand. "I didn't lose everything." He looked toward the little house behind them. "I found everything." She lowered her head, unable to hold back her tears. "You and our daughter are my home now, so don't ever say you ruined my life. You gave me a reason to rebuild it." Those words slowly eased the fear inside her heart. The following morning, the CEO decided not to let fear control their lives. He still went to the strawberry fields. He still helped the farmers harvest fruit. He still recorded production numbers inside his notebook. The villagers noticed something different. He smiled just as before, worked just as hard. But his eyes constantly scanned the surroundings. Every unfamiliar face, every passing motorcycle, every parked vehicle. Nothing escaped his attention anymore. That afternoon, several young men from the village approached him. One of them spoke first. "We heard what happened at the market." The CEO nodded. "We're fine." The young man smiled. "No, you don't understand." He pointed toward the surrounding farms. "You're not alone anymore." One by one, more villagers gathered: a mechanic, a carpenter, a fisherman, several farmers. Even the elderly village chief slowly walked forward. The old man leaned on his walking stick. "This village isn't rich. We don't have security guards. We don't have power. But we've protected each other for generations. If someone wants to hurt one family, they'll have to face the whole village." The CEO looked around. Dozens of familiar faces smiled back at him. He had only lived there for a short time, yet these people had already accepted him as one of their own. For the first time since leaving the city, he truly understood what community meant. Meanwhile, inside the abandoned warehouse, the scar-faced man grew impatient. "We've watched them for days. They're becoming harder to reach." One of his men hesitated. "Maybe we should wait." The scar-faced man slammed his fist onto the table. "No, I didn't come all this way to leave empty-handed." He pulled out his phone. A number had been written on a small piece of paper. The name beside it made him smile. "Looks like we have another friend." He pressed the call button. Far away, inside an elegant office overlooking the city, the CEO's mother slowly answered her private phone. She remained silent while listening. The scar-faced man spoke calmly. "We found your son. He really plans to stay in that village." There was a brief silence. Then she quietly replied, "I don't care what happens to him. But don't touch my granddaughter." The scar-faced man laughed. "You still have a heart after all." She ignored the remark. "I hired people to observe. I didn't hire fools to create unnecessary trouble." He smiled coldly. "Sometimes, trouble creates opportunity." The line went dead. The CEO's mother slowly lowered the phone. For the first time, a trace of worry crossed her face. She had wanted to pressure her son into returning. She had never intended for dangerous criminals to become involved. If events continued spiraling out of control, even she might lose the ability to control them. Back in the village, The CEO finally finished sketching the first complete business plan for the farmers. He gathered everyone beneath the banyan tree once again. This time, he brought several hand-drawn charts, simple packaging ideas, delivery schedules, cost estimates, profit-sharing plans. Everything had been carefully prepared. The farmers listened attentively. Questions turned into discussions. Discussions turned into excitement. By the end of the meeting, more than 20 farming families agreed to work together. The CEO smiled for the first time in days. This is only the beginning. The villagers applauded. Hope slowly returned. But as everyone prepared to leave, a loud engine suddenly echoed across the village. One motorcycle, then another, then a third. The familiar sound instantly silenced the crowd. The scar-faced man and his followers slowly stopped near the entrance to the square. No one moved. The villagers instinctively stepped closer together. The CEO calmly walked to the front, standing between the gang and the farmers. The scar-faced man removed his helmet. His eyes swept across the crowd before stopping on Tieu Lac. "So many people protecting you." He laughed mockingly. "I wonder how long they'll keep smiling." The village chief stepped forward. His voice remained steady despite his age. "This village doesn't welcome people who threaten others." The scar-faced man looked at the old man and smirked. "I'm not here for the village. I'm here for them." He pointed directly at the CEO and Tieu Lac. The CEO didn't step back. Instead, he quietly replied, "If you have a problem, talk to me. Leave everyone else out of it." The scar-faced man's smile slowly disappeared. "So that's your choice." He started his motorcycle again. As the engine roared, he looked directly into the CEO's eyes. "This isn't over." The three motorcycles disappeared in a cloud of dust, leaving behind an uneasy silence. No one celebrated, no one spoke, because everyone understood. The next time those men returned, they might not come only to threaten. Standing in the middle of the village square, surrounded by people who had become his new family, the CEO silently clenched his fists. He had once fought corporate battles inside glass towers. Now, his greatest battle would be fought on dusty village roads. Not for power, not for wealth, but for Tieu Lac, for his daughter, and for the peaceful life they had risked everything to build together. After encountering the gang from Tieu Lac's past, fear follows the family back to their quiet village home. Tieu Lac is overwhelmed with anxiety, terrified that the criminals will return and harm her mother or their young daughter. Determined to keep his family safe, the CEO strengthens their home, repairs the fences, and stays awake through the night guarding the house. Although he no longer has wealth, bodyguards, or the influence he once enjoyed, he refuses to abandon the people he loves. The villagers soon rally around the family, offering support and proving that true strength comes from unity. Meanwhile, the gang secretly watches their every move and even contacts the CEO's mother, creating an even greater threat. As danger closes in from every direction, can the CEO protect Tieu Lac, their daughter, and the peaceful life they have struggled so hard to rebuild?